Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in a few days we're about to break for Christmas. Christmas is a time for family, sleeping in, barbecues, trips to the beach and spending time with our mates and families. Our Christmas holiday has its roots firmly in the Jewish and Christian traditions. It's based on a pretty amazing story about the birth of Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, as many Christians believe. The story of the incarnation of God in a baby born in a stable is remarkable even to me, an atheist, because it's a story about the distant God of heavens coming down to live amongst us on earth. It's a story about that God decreeing that tyranny on earth and utopia in the afterlife is not acceptable, and that freedom and equality must characterise life here on earth as well as the afterlife in heaven. It's the story about the birth of new hope. The Christmas story tells us that a saviour of humanity came not as some great warrior or prince, but wrapped instead in swaddling cloth, a baby born amongst farm animals and in absolute poverty. You know the rest. The shepherds in the field saw a bright star and followed it. 3 wise men turned up with expensive-sounding gifts. The baby grew up a carpenter in ancient Palestine. He stirred up a lot of trouble later as a young man and was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, as legend has it, sometime around 30 AD. But the story doesn't end there. After his death, the new hope that sprang from the stable in Bethlehem started to gather steam. Religious and political elites were threatened by the wild growth of a new religious sect committed to living out here on earth the values of their God once worshipped from afar. The early Christians shared their resources and lived with greater equality amongst themselves than had earlier been known. They believed that the world here on earth could be a better place for ordinary people. Countless Christians were martyred for their faith. Such was the threat that they posed to the ruling political and religious elites. By 112 AD, even the farmers cursed Christ's influence. Christian beliefs on idolatry were causing a slump in agricultural markets as people challenged the need to buy animals for ritual sacrifice to Roman emperors and gods. 2,000 years later, the story of the brief life of Jesus Christ still resonates. That's why Christmas is such an enduring part of our culture. Christmas was the start of some very unlikely trouble and the start of new hope. I'm not a Christian, and there's not historical certainty about the records in the Christian Bible. But what I admire about the Christmas story is that it speaks to values that I share, including some that make me a little uneasy when speaking from this place of privilege and power. I think you'll agree we're pretty far away from a Palestinian stable. But like all parents, particularly those newly acquainted with the role, the story of change arriving in the form of a baby has resonance in my life. And whether we're parents, grandparents, aunties or friends, in our children we find our own awe at the beauty of the planet. They show us what it is to be truly open-minded, and in their ferocious capacity to learn and grow and change, we see that things could truly change and things could truly be better. This Christmas, we wish for all our babies to have their unquestioning need for love generously met. We wish that all our children are treated with patience and understanding, trust and commitment. And we wish that all our parents have the time, support and resources necessary to give our children the best start in life. And for us here in Parliament, I wish that we have the intelligence and compassion to choose to make things better for those who depend on us to make the right calls. Mahatma Gandhi said this about Jesus Christ. He said, "I believe that Jesus belongs not only to Christianity but to the entire world, to all races and all people." Gandhi was right. The hopes and values Jesus Christ articulated during the course of his short life are too important to belong only to Christians. They belong to us all, believers and non-believers alike. They live within us. They are embedded in our culture. They are reflected in most of the world's major religions. These are the values that help lay down the essential nature of what it means to be human and guide us to live a good life. Good to ourselves, good to one another, and good to the world in which we make our livelihoods. I identify with the Christianity that teaches love and compassion towards each other, especially the most vulnerable, the widows, the orphan, the sick, those in prison. Those values inspired some of the world's first hospitals, orphanages, universities, and reforms to the way that we treat those who have broken the law. I also identify with the Christianity that demands we live with truth and justice between one another. Those values challenged the status quo on slavery in Great Britain and moved Martin Luther King to march for equal rights for African Americans. And here in our home, it was through applying those same values that Michael Joseph Savage turned the state on its head in an attempt to provide cradle-to-grave security from poverty and despair. In fact, the very first act of the new Savage government was to grant a special Christmas bonus payment to the unemployed. Now there was a true moment of Christmas in the New Zealand Parliament that gave birth to new hope that our political economy could be bent to protect the vulnerable. That was applied Christianity. Finally, I identify with the Christianity that teaches an awe and respect for the natural world. The Christianity that says tread sacredly through nature, because God incarnated himself in the world through the person of Jesus Christ. St. Francis of Assisi wrote sermons for the birds and taught us to live simply and value nature for its own sake. Listen to the dying words of Father Zosima, a character in the last work of Dostoevsky, the great Christian novelist. He said, "Love all God's creation, the whole and every grain of sand in it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will come at last to love the whole world with an all-embracing love." Those values of love, generosity and a reverence for nature should not sound so out of place in this Parliament. But talk in here is dominated by a different kind of worship, one of economic growth at all costs. We heard this mantra yet again today in the speech from the throne. Today the government said a strong economy provides the resources to then protect the vulnerable and the environment. But compassion and sustainability can't be conditional. The protection of the vulnerable and the environment are necessary preconditions for a successful, fair and sustainable economy. The economic and political agenda announced today undermines some of those values that we celebrate so much at this time of year. What's worse, we still have a virtually universal agreement in this House that mindless economic growth is the overriding purpose of government, if not the purpose of society itself. There is little discussion about the quality of that growth, the costs of that growth, or how we might share the benefits and costs more fairly. There is precious little discussion of how we could possibly have never-ending growth in resource use and the production of pollution on a planet which is ultimately finite. Other parties in this House continue to represent the elite economic and social consensus of the 80s and 90s Labor and national governments, in which we aim to maximise GDP growth and hope that trickle-down will mean that those at the bottom get a few crumbs. 30 years later, and many of our families are still waiting for the trickle-down. Even our private banking system can bring the world to its knees and escape largely unchanged from the meltdown. The Westpac CEO earned $5.4 million salary this year, which included a $260,000 tax cut, an early Christmas present from the government. Why is this government giving taxpayer-funded Christmas bonuses to the obscenely wealthy and not the poor? Is that not an agenda turned on its head? Is that not the Christian values turned on their head? Christ didn't accept that gross inequality is inevitable, and neither should we. Isn't it time we turned the money tables over in the temple once again? Our current political and business worldview has become so focused on endless growth that it has to conveniently ignore the increasing social and environmental collateral damage that comes from mindless growth without values. This Parliament has for the last 30 years conveniently ignored things like runaway climate change, increasing inequality, declining water quality and growing debt. The unqualified pursuit of growth of any kind is no longer delivering the kind of advantages it once did, at least not to most people. We need to grow renewable energy, not inequality, greenhouse emissions and polluted rivers, but that's what we're doing. And international organisations like the OECD, the IMF, the United Nations are starting to reflect this change of heart as they increasingly document and question the environmental sustainability of economic growth at any cost and the growing inequality within developed societies as wealth is further concentrated even as our economies grow. We know that better outcomes in health, education, happiness and social trust are no longer correlated with growing levels of GDP in developed countries. If the government's measure of progress was expanded from simple changes in GDP to include social and environmental indicators, it would be pretty clear that in nearly every other measure of progress, we as a society have gone backwards. Our problem is not so much about earning more, it's about sharing what we do earn more fairly. We could earn more as a country but still be poorer. We could still be poorer even though we're earning more, because if the wealth isn't shared around, many of us will be poorer. The evidence is striking. A less unequal society means that we tend to live longer, healthier, safer lives. And that's true for all of us, not just those at the bottom of the heap. More sharing, the Christian sharing, is actually good for everyone. It's the big differences in wealth within our society that drive many of the major problems that now bedevil us. And it's not just about equality of opportunity, but that's important. It's actually also about equality of outcomes. It's not surprising that societies that allow their economic systems to produce great inequality are socially dysfunctional. How could a society be anything other than dysfunctional when our society and our social values are so deeply at odds with the outcomes that we're getting from our economic system? On the one hand, our economic system is producing vast differences of wealth and massive inequality. On the other hand, the holiday we're just about to celebrate is a holiday all about sharing and looking after each other and compassion. When those at the very top earn closer to what those at the very bottom earn, suddenly everyone is better off. We live longer, we suffer less from mental illness, we're less violent, we trust more, we lock up fewer people, we have better health, we have higher levels of social mobility. Now there's an extraordinary fact. Societies that are more equal have more social mobility than highly stratified societies. And we live with less fear, and I would like to live in a society with less fear. I believe in a society like that, one where we trust one another and look after one another, a society where we are our brother's keeper, not their bitter rival. Societies with low inequality have simply found ways to share wealth more fairly. It's as simple as that, and their economies do better. It's something we've implicitly understood before. The post-war consensus from the 1940s to the 1970s was a time when New Zealand enjoyed some of the lowest rates of inequality in the world. The neoliberal agenda of the 80s and 90s largely destroyed that. This Christmas, the government could help turn growing inequality on its head by raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Such a gift would help 275,000 New Zealanders currently trapped in very low-wage jobs. The government could extend family payments to families out of work instead of punishing them. The government could offer new hope at Christmas to hundreds of thousands of New Zealand kids. That's what a Green government would do. Our plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour is one of a number of costed initiatives we laid out before the election as part of our plan to address child poverty. All up, we could raise about 100,000 children out of poverty by committing around $680 million of additional government spending to this endeavour, and we costed how we'd pay for that.